morning, everyone. Really excited to welcome you to the next session of the day. My name is Patrick Wheeler, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Center for Digital Strategies at Tuck, and looking forward to an exciting conversation over the course of the next hour. I'm joined by Bradley Webb. Bradley Webb is part of the core team building Surge, where he heads product and growth, which it's a natural language kind of powerhouse company working a lot on training and learning of AI models. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. He was employee number 4 at Surge. Three at Surge. That's a big deal, right? You don't want to get that wrong in a startup.
Huge deal.
Yeah. He has previously worked, was on the senior product management team at Facebook, worked with AppFolio as a lead product manager, is an OnDeck fellow, is a deep tech fellow with OnDeck, is a graduate of San Diego State University, and most importantly, is a graduate here of the Tuck School of Business. Bradley, welcome back.
Thanks. Yep, very excited to be back. We've done this 3 times now. Patrick was just mentioning that I need to get an apartment here because I'm here all the time, and that sounds absolutely fantastic. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys today. Like Patrick was mentioning, Surge is a big part of the ecosystem that exists to make the base models that you guys have all interacted with possible, right? So ChatGPT, Claude, Bard, Llama, all of those models are built on kind of open web text, but also on human feedback and learning. And Surge is the primary provider of the human element for many of those models.
Talk a little bit more for the audience, because I think we have a range here in the room about reinforcement learning using human factors. Can you tell us just a little bit more about how that works and sort of how Surge kind of makes that happen in partnership with these companies?
Sure. So the best way to kind of orient around kind of the evolution of large language models is to think back, let's say 4 or 5 years ago, when you were using Gmail and it would start to suggest text, or maybe even Grammarly, right? It would suggest text, your text messages even suggest text. It would try to autocorrect. All of those were large language models. They were the earliest kind of incantations of those models, but they weren't particularly sophisticated, right? Like if you had interacted with those models then, there wasn't anything revolutionary about them. Nobody 5 years ago was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, it's going to change the world, right? And a lot of that had to do with the level of sophistication of the human element of those trainings. There's a lot of other reasons why as well, but the human component is what allowed them to start following instructions. So that when you asked it to do something, it didn't just think that it was going to continue on writing a sentence, that it was actually comprehended that what you were asking it to do was follow instructions. So when I say, make me a list of X, Y, and Z, it actually makes a list and puts the relevant elements on there rather than like thinking you're writing an email and trying to like autocomplete what it would think the next questions are. And so there are a couple important parts of this process as it comes to human training of this. The first is actually just literally teaching it to follow instructions, right? So you give it a prompt, and you also give it a response. So let's use the coding example because it's probably the most simple. Right? So if I wanted to train a model to write code, I would start by asking it to give me, let's say, a recursive sort function in Python. And the data that I would provide is both that prompt and actually a recursive sort function in Python. And so I would feed both the prompt and response. And so the model starts to learn how it should respond when it's given these types of prompts, right? And this is that like very basic supervised fine-tuning that we've done in machine learning for ages. And the next piece of this is that reinforcement learning from human feedback, the RLHF, which is reward modeling. So then you start prompting it with other queries, like teach me how to do a for loop, right? Give me try except language in Python. And you evaluate the quality of those responses, right? This one is better, that one is better, this one is better, that one is better. And over time, the model starts to learn how to respond to these types of queries and how the query responses should be tailored to your specific interests or needs. And that has a lot of variables that you might want to put into it because you might want the models to be right. For coding queries, that matters, right? Like the correctness of the answer does matter because you want the code to compile. But maybe for creative writing, it actually doesn't matter, right? Like hallucinations are great, and so you want it to make up really fanciful things. And so you have to teach it based on the kind of parameters of how you expect to use it, and that's how kind of these RLHS systems start to get a lot more complexity, right? Because you have all of these parameters that you're trying to reward model into these models so that they can properly reflect the values of we as humans want to get out from those models. So happy to get much further into the weeds, but that's kind of a 30,000 foot.
And so you are a B2B business working with companies within the AI ecosystem. You know, that is a space that's really grown really quickly. I think you mentioned this is your third trip. I think we first sat down it was in this room in the same exact spot, maybe spring of 2022, talking about GPT-3 and some of the early, kind of tools out there. A lot's happened.
Yep.
Talk about how that pace of change and what's going on today, and how different this conversation, that we can have today is compared to, say, a year and a half ago.
Yeah. So I think actually what's different is just that you guys are all here. Yeah.
It was a smaller group back in 2022.
It was a smaller group, but also there's a reflection that like everybody knows what ChatGPT is now. I don't have to describe that and explain it. I don't need to explain what a large language model is. But those things existed before this conversation, right? They existed in 2022. They existed in 2018, back further. And so I think a lot of what has happened is that technology has now become kind of well understood and kind of the distribution mechanisms have started to take hold and get it out in front of people that can then use it to do interesting and fanciful things. And so in some cases, the technology has progressed, right? Obviously, GPT-4 is better than GPT-3. There are other models now, Claude, Bard, Llama, on and on and on. But structurally, this has been something that the technology industry has been investing in for decades, right? Like this isn't new in the sense that yesterday it didn't exist and today it does. It's just that we now have kind of a view of how this might impact our world. And that's maybe unique in this situation because other technologies that might have had kind of similar salience didn't affect us, kind of white-collar workers, in the same way that this technology is clearly going to. And so I think that is also a component of this, is that it acutely affects kind of the work that we do and the work that we will do forever into the future.
I think the comment you made about the transition really being that a widespread audiences now understand and have in many cases used these tools or are using these tools, that also sort of suggests one of the questions around hype cycle and thinking about where we are in that cycle. Are we at the peak of that hype cycle? Are we kind of started, how does this look different, I guess, is one of the questions. Is we've seen these cycles before. We've seen this with mobile, we've seen this with cloud, we've seen this going back to, over 20 years to the web kind of hype cycle. Is this a pattern that we've seen before? Is this different? It feels, for many folks that have been around the industry, I'll say myself included at times, it feels very different this time than some of the past hype cycles. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, I'll say it's different than crypto for sure.
Yeah, crypto.
A lot more substance here. So I'm a firm believer in there's nothing new under the sun. And so I actually think that the AI cycle is going to mirror very similarly the mobile or the web kind of cycles, in that we're going to see kind of large investment in these technologies from the existing ecosystem of companies that have a vested interest in kind of making these platforms available more broadly, right? Like we're already seeing Facebook and Google and Microsoft make massive investments in these technologies because they're very critical to the way that they can continue to do the work in their businesses. Over time, we're going to see more and more new entrants into this space as we start to see new ways to take this technology to serve new problems that we didn't recognize that we had before, or to serve problems that we recognized that we had but we couldn't serve before, right? Like the idea that we have kind of digital, devices as prescription FDA-approved,
digital therapeutics.
Digital therapeutics. That was something that maybe is now possible, that wasn't possible before, that these models enable, that will be an opportunity for some sort of disruption. But I do think that that this cycle isn't inherently different or new or revolutionary in the sense that I think it will mirror a lot of what we saw in the mobile or digital internet.
It's a provocative statement because I think what you see across kind of a lot of folks in tech as well as media and even the general public do kind of disagree with that statement fundamentally, right? Not all, for there are many that don't, but it's an interesting point that I think you make in that we have seen some of these cycles before. Right now, we're looking at very large companies kind of leading this charge. Do you expect those companies to kind of continue on that path? Like, how does this kind of thinking forward now, how does that mature, the market mature, and how does it get to that point at which we see the replication from mobile, right? Where it sort of starts out as a platform and then over time value is added, more and more value and more disruption happens as a result.
I mean, we can already see the kind of seedlings of that evolution, right? Like if we look at, let's just use OpenAI and ChatGPT as the example. ChatGPT as this platform, like a mobile operating system, OpenAI, Microsoft are investing large amounts of money to make sure that model is really effective and it's really broad, right? Like ChatGPT can write haikus and it can also code, right? Chances are that at an application layer, you don't need it to do both, right? I mean, outside of like an academic situation where you might have a poetry class and a coding class, like in business, I don't need it to do both, right? Like I don't need a model to write haikus. I do need it to code, right? And so over time, what we'll see is a suite of applications that spring up that serve very niche kind of problems that are specific to that business or that user in a way that helps us kind of solve the problems that we have. Like maybe you do need it to write haikus, but frankly, ChatGPT is not very good at writing haikus. And so you're going to want something that actually kind of solves that problem for you in a much better way. And so that's where we'll start to see, much like we did in mobile, kind of applications spring up that are dedicated specifically to the problems that you have to solve, but that are built on the foundation of these models that these companies are continually investing in. And so we'll see this kind of ecosystem of base models operating very similar to mobile operating systems and applications that sit on top of those things to solve problems for users, right? Because OpenAI has no incentive to try to solve every single person's unique problems or every single company's unique problems. They absolutely want to delegate that to their customers and allow their customers to solve the problems that their customers have. And I think in that way, we'll see that evolution occur. Now, in the short term, that's likely to exist within the existing infrastructure of business, right? Coke is investing a ton in generative AI, and Spotify and Shopify, and kind of all of these companies that have kind of early forays into using GPT to solve problems, but are largely just taking advantage of the fact that they have existing businesses that they can make better based on solving problems for their customers better. But over time, what we'll see is more applications spring up that are new and novel and unique based on people finding new, novel, unique problems from their customers. And I think that's the evolution that we'll see, and I think that's why it will largely mirror the mobile kind of evolution in that way, because the model of how this will work is so inherently similar. And because AI, in this context, isn't it's not AGI, right? Like these generative models are interesting, powerful tools, but they are still inherently infrastructure, right? Like they're inherently something that we're going to build on top of to solve problems, like cloud, right? Like AWS didn't disrupt the whole world. It just made it so that companies could build better software to solve problems for their customers.
So you're bullish on the longer term kind of entrepreneurial growth in this space.
Absolutely, yeah.
Fantastic. So we all, going through those past cycles, we also saw a lot of really large companies struggle to adapt. Like, do you anticipate, the tech companies struggling to adapt? Do you anticipate kind of traditional industries struggling to make this kind of adaptation that allows them to thrive going forward in building solutions?
Yeah, I think the challenge with AI in this context is that taking advantage of it requires being built for this problem, right? It requires kind of a different perspective and a different lens on how you solve problems. And many companies don't have the ecosystem in place to be able to take advantage of that. I mean, I worked at a tech company that wasn't Facebook, and even that company struggled to actually kind of get a handle on its own data in a way that was effective enough to be able to have like a reasonable AI strategy to solve problems. And so if kind of existing tech companies that founded in the last 10 or 15 years are going to struggle to take advantage of that, older companies that have lots more legacy problems are going to struggle even more mightily, right? Like, I spent a lot of time talking to folks in the military, the Navy, the Air Force, the Army. My background, I worked for the Navy for a while, and so we're trying to think about how we can help the military kind of evolve their applications of AI. And it's just so very clear that kind of the legacy systems that are in place there are going to make it even more difficult for them to be adopters of this. Now, the US military is going to figure it out because they have a lot of money to spend and an imperative to do that. But a lot of companies aren't going to have that same kind of bandwidth to be able to do that, or the imperative, right? Like they can't just stumble through this problem until they solve it because their shareholders just simply won't allow that.
There's been, for going back before the kind of like rise of ChatGPT and generative, there's been a lot of discussion around the lack of available talent with the skill sets within the AI world. Like, do you still see that as a problem, as a sort of limiting factor here as well? Or is that something that's starting to be alleviated a little bit more?
I mean, talent is a huge problem, just generally speaking. Hiring is hard. And that's something that I had always heard said and never really like understood what it meant until we had to hire people. And it's hard because what I think I didn't understand at the time but do now is that you're not just looking for somebody who's capable, but you're looking for somebody who's capable at the things that your business needs. And oftentimes those are very specific needs, right? And so finding the person that can solve that problem is much harder than finding somebody who's capable, right? And for a startup, and this is maybe different for other companies, but for a startup, that set of needs that we have is maybe more acute, and we have less time available to kind of let you learn on the job. We need people who know how to solve that problem. And the same is going to be true for big businesses that are trying to solve AI problems, right? Like they don't have time to let people come in and learn on the job to figure out how to solve these problems. They need people who can solve these. And the kind of availability of people who know how to solve these problems is just very small, right? Like this ecosystem itself is relatively small. And frankly, it's going to be hard to compete with the companies that already exist in this ecosystem who can pay very sizable salaries and have equity compensation packages that are very robust. And I think that's another challenge that a lot of companies are going to face, especially legacy companies that aren't tech companies, is the recognition that the compensation for folks in this role might actually seem just astonishing to them, right? Like it might seem like executive compensation in kind of the view of the world that they have.
You've mentioned sort of data. I forget the exact year, but there's the famous cover, Data is the New Oil, kind of Time magazine cover. Can you talk about data? You've mentioned a few times that maybe companies who have been stockpiling data because it's gotten very, very inexpensive to both collect and to store data, have a lot of data, but maybe it's not usable. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that is and sort of where we go from here on that?
Yeah, so data is incredibly important, right? Like our business exists to generate more of it. And so, the value of data is not something that I think is in question. I think the challenge for most businesses is that it's really difficult to take all of that stockpiled data and make sense of it because it wasn't stored with intention, right? Like we didn't store it with an idea of how we were actually going to use it. And therefore we have no idea kind of like where it came from or what we were recording at the time or we weren't recording the right things. And so in that way, we have this kind of wealth of data that's sitting there, but that it's inaccessible to kind of use for the things that we want it to use. Or, one of the other things that we've seen is that the places in which the data are stored are incompatible with the other data that you need, right? Like you have to enrich it through some centralized location, and those data are then like malformed to each other, right? I need data from here, and I need data from here. I need to bring them together. I have a data lake or whatever, right? So I can literally bring them together, but I can't bring them together in a way that makes them actually usable, right? Because I didn't store them with the understanding that I needed to bring them together, both together, to actually do something. And so I think a lot of the challenge for legacy companies is actually thinking through, like, how do we almost throw away everything that we had done and start forward of what problems do we need to solve and what data do we need to solve that. I think for newer companies, this is less of a problem because they're starting out with intention around we're solving this problem, so we know we need the data for this problem, and we know we're in an ecosystem where this data matters. But I think there's a big gulf there. The beauty of kind of these generative AI models is actually that they kind of paper over some of those problems because you don't need to train models from scratch, right. Which does make this era maybe a little more interesting, right? 5 years ago, if you wanted to introduce AI into your business, you actually had to train those models from nothing, which meant that you needed data internally, you had to build it, you needed your existing, software applications to be generating the data you need. Now, OpenAI has kind of done a lot of that hard work for you, and you can enrich that with specific things. And so in some ways, throwing away all of that old data that you stockpiled isn't as painful because you don't need as much new data to kind of fine-tune that model to do the thing that you want. So that is an interesting evolution of the time.
It's an interesting point about this balance between the way we used to kind of think about AI and the way we currently do. At the same time, there are a number of companies out there, startups in the space, that are kind of selling a vision of this, of just dump all your data into our tool and we'll train it and you've got a usable tool. You've been working on that problem with some pretty big companies. I think I'm not giving away, you've worked with some pretty large companies to train foundation models as well as to help with their models. Do you see those kind of, that problem persisting of this duality of quality within tool sets, and how can companies maybe navigate how to make those decisions in a way that doesn't lead them down a path to kind of diminishing returns or even negative impact?
So
it's a tough question. It's not an easy question, but it's an important one, I think.
I do think that the base models that exist now have maybe changed the way we think about data. And if I were advising, companies about how to think about data, I think the previous kind of worldview of data was let's get a lot of it, we'll use that to train, and we'll store it really cheaply, and the data is cheap, right? Facebook released a paper, I think 2 or 3 months ago now, maybe longer, 5 or 6 months ago, called Less is More, where they took a few examples that were very, very high quality and used that to fine-tune a model. And what they found was that 1,000 examples that were very high quality were able to induce the model to very high capability level in these very narrow bands of things that they wanted it to accomplish. And so in that way, the quality of the data being very high was more valuable than having lots of it. But what you kind of have to sacrifice when you want really high quality data, is that it's going to cost a lot more. And I think that adjustment is actually very uncomfortable for companies, where it used to be where I'm storing data for pennies, right? Fractions of pennies. And so my data costs are very, very low. If we buy data sets, they're relatively inexpensive, and I can reuse them over and over and over again. And there's this adjustment where companies are now starting to realize that to get the type of really high quality data they need, the per unit cost of that data is very high. And frankly, that's been a realization that a lot of our customers have come to, is that their data costs should almost match their compute costs, right? So you're talking hundreds of millions, billions of dollars on data, because the value of very high quality data is so instrumental to these models. And that the volume then at that quality then can be very valuable, right? And creating really high quality data is extremely expensive, right? I think one of the examples that was brought up earlier was around having trained maybe psychologists evaluate,
Right.
and like what does a psychologist cost per hour, right? Like I can tell you it's not $5, right? It's not $8, right? Like you're talking $150 an hour, right? So what is that going to cost to generate data, right? Like that piece of data might actually cost you $750. Right? For one piece of data.
Yeah.
And you probably want it triple reviewed, so now you're talking about $2,200, right? And so the costs of data have increased significantly in ways that companies, I think, are very uncomfortable with because their kind of legacy perspectives on data are very kind of outdated.
Shifting gears a bit, we heard from speakers in the first session, as well as from Dean Slaughter in the opening remarks that Dartmouth has been a player in this space for a while, and one of the ways that we kind of bring our expertise to bear is thinking about risks and responsibility with AI. Can we talk a little bit about responsibility or AI, responsible AI and sort of risk profiling? How do you think about some of the risks that are kind of most concerning to you and to folks that you work with in the industry? How should we be thinking about managing risk in this context?
Safety is, I think, a big focus within kind of the customers that we have. It's something that I think is a big focus in part because the companies that are investing in these base models are established brands with kind of
lots to lose,
right? I think what's interesting and maybe kind of helps prime this example is we saw ChatGPT launch, and then within a few months, we saw both Google and Facebook launch alternatives. And it wasn't because ChatGPT and OpenAI took years and years and years to develop this, and Google and Facebook could figure it out in a few months. It was because Google and Facebook had been working on the same technology for years, but were doing it at a very slow pace because of the risks to their brand, right? And that once kind of OpenAI demonstrated that there was demand for this type of tool, that Facebook and Google could then accelerate their development of these applications, right? But we still see that those brands have a much different tolerance for the types of things that they're willing to let their models say and talk about and kind of address than other companies, right? And so one of the things that we work with our customers on is actually how do we think about safety, right? And what are the parameters that we need to apply when we're doing that? And honestly, that it's very unique and specific to individual customers, right? And the application, right? If you have a chat application, you are maybe going to be more sensitive to political topics, right? Because it's kind of like outside the scope of something that you want your chat application. But if you have a search application, political topics are very newsy and therefore like highly relevant to the results, right? And so your user expectations are going to be different in those situations, and therefore kind of the safety protocols that you put in place for those applications are also subsequently different. But kind of going back to what we were talking about with RLHF and kind of human feedback, that's one of the primary mechanisms for how we think and deploy safety into models, right? One of the primary kind of purposes of Surge is, or kind of like our mission is to make sure that AI reflects the values of us humans so that we don't have those Cyberdyne technology issues in the future, that we have models that understand kind of the value kind of functions that we as humans have and can reflect that when they're actually providing their outputs.
It's interesting. You worked at Facebook, now Meta. Famously move fast and break things. We seem to be seeing a shift away from that in this case. Is that a more reflection of a maturation within the industry? I won't point fingers specifically at Facebook because I think they're similar to many other companies in this regard. Or is that an indication that AI is a little bit different in the risk profile?
Good question. I'm sure some of it is a maturation of the tech ecosystem. It's easy to move fast and break things when you're not critical infrastructure, right? And at this point, Facebook is critical infrastructure for lots of the world. And so some of that is certainly a maturation. Some of that is, the industry being kind of more accountable to regulators and policy writers for their technology, right? And understanding that if they aren't thoughtful about how they develop this, then Congress and other regulators abroad will make sure that their technologies are regulated. I think the safety debate kind of broadly within AI is very difficult because it's still so early in the technology's evolution. And I think it's based on a lot of misunderstanding of the technology itself, right? A statistical model that predicts the next word is not sentient, right? And it's not going to kind of evolve into sentience, right? Like that's an entirely different model, right? Like Jan LeCun talks about this, right? Like the LLMs don't even have kind of the awareness of a dog, much less a human, right? And so there's going to be this like different approach to getting to AGI, and LLMs aren't that. But there is kind of like a broad misunderstanding of kind of the probabilistic statistical models that underpin them. And inherently, neural networks are not kind of discernible, right? Like that's kind of like a function of how a neural net is designed, is like I can't inspect it, right? Because it has these layers of things that are doing that are invisible to me. And so there's lots of inference happening in there that is hard for me to understand. And so it's both the mathematics of it all are difficult to understand and are inherently opaque.
So we're seeing, some of the perceived risks around AGI and other things kind of not being, in your kind of point of view, not being a real risk right now. We're seeing that the players, the infrastructure layer players, the big tech companies are taking this pretty serious. And I would agree. I think in my time working with technology firms, first they've talked about this more than I've seen them talk about other issues in the past. I think there's a recognition there. And yet we have a lot of bad actors out there. You talk about sort of the ways that this technology maybe presents different types of risk, whether that's geopolitical risks, economic risks. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's an area where there is some concern that I think is a little bit founded.
Absolutely, yeah. So I do think that there is risk in AI, and I think the most acute version of that risk is state actors, right? Like, or proxies for state actors. The technology is very powerful, and it is very expensive, and that inherently, at the moment, kind of limits the number of participants who can actually do anything with that risk, right? Like technology. But that superset of things includes state actors, right? Who can invest heavily in the models, that can invest heavily in the capabilities, and those have an inherently destabilizing kind of effect on the geopolitical environment that are potentially very risky. And it creates very difficult incentives for our country, our military, and kind of democratically aligned countries across the globe to think about how we want to participate in that environment, right? These, the models that we build, the capabilities that we build, if we kind of take an analogy of tanks. Tanks are very expensive. They also have no purpose outside of, fighting
single
wars,
purpose,
right?
Yeah.
AI is not the same, right? Like AI has this like very kind of like important part that it plays in our ecosystem, in our economy, et cetera. But they are also weapons of war, right? And so how do we think about how we want to weaponize that as a military, as a country, as a democracy, how our adversaries are weaponizing that, right? And what limitations, if any, we should be placing on ourselves in a situation where our adversaries are almost certainly not, right? And so I think that creates very acute risks from a safety perspective for AI, given kind of the evolution curves that we see in AI, right? Like, I don't need to worry about any of you buying an F-35, right? But very soon you'll have like extremely powerful AI in your phone in a way that kind of gives you the ability to kind of have very acute safety concerns that are distributed.
Yeah, I mean, we're approaching, right, we're a little over a year away from an election, and we've seen some of these patterns from nation states in the past. Is that something you worry about? Is that something that you think industry folks that you've talked to are worrying about?
I think that's where we'll see the hype cycle come crashing down, right? And I think that's the conversation I've had with lots of people, is that AI is really powerful and amazing, and that everyone will realize how dangerous it is when we see the outcome of the 2024 election and the simplicity with which we can generate all sorts of misinformation, right? If we thought 2016 and 2020 were, awash in misinformation, it will be much, much worse when you consider the fact that, the like best case for ChatGPT is to make stuff up, right? Like, that's absolutely the best use case, and
Great
like
content, yeah.
and so it's gonna
make it sound real,
and make it sound real
Yeah.
and confident, and so I think the 2024 election is where we'll start to see that take effect. And again, the primary actors of those misinformation kind of rings in 2016 and 2020 were other nation states, right? And so I think that's kind of just like a reaffirmation that the risks with safety and AI kind of are at a much different level and have like a much different mechanism for constraint than.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think never has there been a time needed for more engagement across multidisciplinary teams, which is what we really do well here at Dartmouth. That's a good segue into talking to our, directing some thoughts at our students. And in a minute, we're going to open up to the audience questions. So get your questions ready, and we'll have folks come around with microphones. What advice or what guidance do you have for our students in the audience? We have a diverse array of students, obviously a number of students here from Tuck, engineering students from Thayer, computer science students, liberal arts majors, students from the medical school. What kind of advice do you have for our students around kind of where to go in this space, if they're interested in working in this space? What should they be doing? What should they be thinking about? Where can they add value?
Yeah, so the kind of the power and beauty of these models is that they kind of accentuate or accelerate expertise, right? I think you were just talking about a BCG study, right?
Yeah.
Where the models had a profound effect on kind of raising the minimum bar, right, for
Bring the
output.
floor up quite
Bringing the floor up significantly, right? And so if we kind of apply that model back onto how this is going to affect kind of the white-collar workforce, the knowledge workforce, it's about having some expertise that the models can accentuate, right? And knowing how to apply that. And so that's soft skills that Tuck teaches, certainly, but it's also having like actual expertise in a topic, right? And not trying to be kind of a broad generalist, but knowing a thing that when the model's lying to you, right? And knowing a thing well enough to know how to ask questions of the model, right? Mary was talking about how she used the model as a companion for her art, right? And in a very similar way, you want to use these models as companions for your work, but you can only do that if you have kind of expertise in a field such that you know that that's wrong, or that that's not going to work for your customer, or that that function isn't callable, that method isn't written properly. And so it's really about building that expertise. And I think oftentimes we incentivize kind of broadening, right? And kind of getting this really, really broad view of things when the models actually have that really broad view. And so then the unique value of us humans is having this like acute understanding of an area and relying on the model to bring in kind of all of those broad concepts in, and then you kind of tuning it as you go. And so I think my advice would be to like really lean in on building expertise in an area and focusing and understanding something deeply, and not worrying too much about having those blinders on. I think we're kind of coaxed from a very early age to like take those blinders off, but in some ways, like the value is going to accrue most to the people who can have that expertise and take advantage of the models.
Great. All right, we've got some folks here with microphones. If you'd like to ask a question, we'll kind of come around.
Patrick, all great questions. Bradley, thanks for sharing it. I'm a software engineer. The question goes on the data, on the infrastructure. Technically, all institutions, and we have very good relational database, and not on terabyte, but gigabytes, and all are good quality. Databases, they can have their own models in future. Do you visualize anything like every databases, like a Postgres to Oracle, coming up with like a special learning mechanism for such databases where LLM model can be fit on it to very easily? Could you see my vision where I'm going? So what is your vision about current existing relational databases having their own machine learning algorithm built in so that LLM can work with it easily?
So an LLM built into a model, or into a database, essentially. So we've actually seen some really interesting applications of LLMs built into tools. I've never seen it kind of built into the database itself. It could be really interesting in terms of kind of exploration, of like asking it to kind of explore what's going on in your database. I think one of the things that we see as like the hello world of LLMs is like chat with your PDF, right? And so you could imagine something very similar where if you kind of built an LLM onto a database, you could have a conversation with that database. I mean, we see it very obviously in that it can write SQL, right? And so in that sense, so I do think that that's probably an application where you could get a ton of value from kind of like being able to understand what's going on and make connections within your data that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation. And I wanted to come back to what you were saying about hiring. I was very interested in your identifying that there is such a small talent pool. Everyone is competing for that talent pool. And it was actually last week at a talk that Ruha Benjamin from Princeton gave. And one of the things that she was talking about were some of her concerns about how a very small talent pool is making these fundamental decisions about new technologies, new infrastructures for a very diverse society within the United States, and of course, the global impact, even multiplying that sense of diversity. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about how you think about how you're composing these teams and how you're working at that intersection of a very small talent pool, having to hire, but also building these technologies that are going to have transformative impact on our societies and global societies.
Totally. So I think there's two elements to that. So Surge, kind of one of the things that was really important to us and kind of the founding story of Surge is built on a lack of access to really high quality data that kind of stems from kind of the antiquated approach to getting data, which was outsourcing it, right? So you would, a lot of the legacy players in our field, their approach to sourcing data was to go partner with BPOs that would outsource to low-cost countries across the globe. The problem with that is that it incentivizes kind of this mean approach to an idea, right? So you're going to get the average, and you're going to get the average of kind of a relatively low kind of conceptual understanding. And language itself is inherently hard, right? Like this approach is maybe more tenable in vision, where concepts are kind of less dynamic, right? A stop sign is a stop sign is a stop sign. It's kind of looked the same for hundreds of years or decades. But like the phrase Omicron, right? Like take a survey across 7 years, and it probably means something very different at the beginning of that 7 years, in the middle of that 7 years, at the end of that 7 years, right? And so language is more nuanced and complicated. And so our approach to data and data collection and training is actually to build a very broad but highly educated marketplace. And so in that way, even though kind of our corporate team is small, our workforce and the marketplace of people that are providing inputs into these models is very broad and very diverse, right? And so I think in that way, the data that's being used to train these models is, I think, subsequently more diverse and much higher quality than kind of the ecosystem has traditionally had access to. The corporate teams, I think, is an entirely different problem, and it is kind of uniquely challenging. The one thing I will say is that it is a very high demand field, and the best companies have access to very diverse pools of talent, right? Because it is the most in demand, right? Like if you were in OpenAI's shoes or Anthropic or Google or Facebook, right? Like right now, they can get the pick of the absolute best people across the planet who want to work on these problems, right? And so in that way, they have kind of an ability to kind of build diversity into kind of how they hire. And we see that. I think there's a challenge, certainly, as you go further down that spectrum, right? Like startups are going to have a hard time hiring diversity. But I don't know how we solve that problem. I think we're very intentional about it from a hiring perspective and doing what we can to source from places that are maybe non-obvious. But there are just pure limitations to kind of that. And we look at places like Facebook, Google, Anthropic, and OpenAI as potential sources of potential hires, right? Because they have access to that talent, and we can hire from them because they've already done the work to kind of find that talent and train it.
I think this is also a unique problem when you expand globally, right? Language is not universal in the sense that, well, English is a pretty well-spoken language. There are models that are being developed in China that are different than the models here. Models developed in other developing markets where maybe perhaps there is less kind of a diversity. I actually think one of the things that's been good about the tech sector approaching AI and some other kind of technologies in the last few years is this recognition that historically they haven't been good enough in this area. When we talk to folks, we do see a significant emphasis on trying to get more diverse teams in place to, make a difference on a number of fronts as well as from a bias perspective and trying to get different ideas in the room. Not that it's perfect, and that's not there yet, but to your point, at least from a tech industry perspective, I think there's a significant recognition of the need to do that. But this is going to be complicated for a while, I think. It's just going to be a pretty complicated problem to solve for a while.
Thank you, Bradley. And I think your insights on data was especially enlightening. I have two questions that I'd like to seek your guidance for. The first one is, what do you think will happen to legacy companies that just cannot fathom the compensation level or the cost of really cleaning up their data? Do you think that they will be outcompeted by tech companies who will do finance or legal? So that's my first question. And my second question was about hiring. When you look at OpenAI and Google Brain, a lot of these companies seek PhDs. And I was wondering what if your company is also seeking for PhDs and people who have those higher degrees, what is it that you see in those candidates versus people who have worked in industry or have a master's or bachelor's degree?
Yep. So I don't think there's anything unique to say about legacy companies. They'll either adapt or they'll not. They'll go bankrupt, right? Like that's just the natural kind of evolution of the ecosystem. And if they can't compete, then they'll kind of just stumble along until they run out of money. I don't think that, so I think there's, for OpenAI, Google, Facebook, Anthropic, et cetera, the focus on PhDs is largely because what they're doing is very complex from a math and science perspective, and so that expertise is essential, right? They're also looking for people who are doing it or have done very extensive research in this space, right? And so in that way, if you're looking to get into these companies kind of in the technical capacity, that's going to be a kind of essential component, unless you have kind of this very broad kind of evidence-based like portfolio of I've done this work, I know how to do this work, right? For non-technical roles, so anything that isn't building and training a model, then their hiring is going to look very similar to hiring at any major tech company, right? So they're going to prioritize experience and expertise in your particular field. Very similar to us, right? Like our focus is finding exceptional people who have done the things that we need them to do at very high levels and can kind of operate at the pace and speed and expertise level of a startup, right? And so that's not going to be different from a Google or a Facebook. Now, we aren't hiring PhDs because we're not investing heavily in building our own models at the moment. But if we were to start building our own models, I'm certain that we would start hiring those people who have that expertise and who have kind of gained that expertise through that research.
That's going to be a good place to stop for today for this session. I want to thank Bradley for sharing with us, coming out and always being so supportive of Tuck, as well as sharing excellent insights today. Really, thank you, Bradley.
Thank you.